So hello to everyone and welcome to our last Friday for corruptions. This is the last Friday of these seminars. So as we did the previous times, these seminars will be recorded, and we will give you later on then information about where you can find and watch the videos. Now the program for today is very, very interesting, and what we are going to have is the following. We are going to have Christina Weissmuller from the University of Bern in Switzerland, talking about tolerating bribery in public, private, and hybrid organizations, and the discussant will be Jeremy Seltz. And then Jeremy Seltz and Guillermo Matteau from ESCA School of Management in France. We talk about rent-seeking tournament with sabotage, fighting antisocial behaviors with envy, and Michael Kurstingen will be the discussant, but unfortunately Michael will not be able to be the discussant here because right now he's flying somewhere, like on an airplane. So I will be the alter ego of Michael because very nicely he sent interesting comments on the paper of Jeremy and Guillermo. And then we will have Joka Coxa and Michael Gansmeyer talking about governance in regions and cities, and Julia Korosteleva will be the discussant. As I said before, this seminar series is video recorded, so it will be broadcasted quite soon on respective channels. So a link of this video is here on the Center for Political Economy and Institutional Studies. You will find it in a week or 2 weeks' time. And this is the link to the series. So if you go there, you can easily find all the Fridays and the relative video recording. Last thing, and then I stop talking. Given that this is the last Friday, I take advantage to say that if the participants, speakers, and our followers wants to know a little bit more about our future events or want to be included in our mailing list, please just email to one of us, one of the organizers here, and we will be happy to be in contact with you and keep you posted. Now I'm very happy give the words and the audience to Christina. Christina, the audience is all yours, and you have 20 minutes for presenting your paper, and then there will be a discussion.
Excellent, Luca. Thank you very much. I think I can stop you sharing the screen.
Yes.
And then I'm sharing my screen.
Yes.
Which we're going to do with a PowerPoint. So there's not going to be any fancy graphs going on, but I keep it safe, I guess. So thank you very much for having me. Last but not least, on the last day of our little workshops. Today I'm going to present to you part of a larger ongoing research project that focuses on the micro level dynamics of defined behavior and corruption in the public sector and also in the private and hybrid sector and organizations. As you can see from the author list, which is rather lengthy, our research team is distributed all throughout the world. We actually have even more partners than that. And the paper I'm going to present today is called Tolerating Bribery in Public, Private, Hybrid Organizations, Behavioral Evidence from 4 Replication Studies from 4 different countries. It is very much a pitch and work in progress, so any kind of comments are extremely welcome. And on behalf of also my co-authors, Ariane van Mittelstein, Lotte de Waal, Ada Ritz, who I think is also here today, Robert Christensen, Zetsu Su, Richard Walker, and Han Yu Xiao. Thank you very much for listening. So let's dive right in. Public sector corruption is an ongoing and worldwide phenomenon that also is one of the top priorities on the OECD development links, and we are all striving to learn more about what makes people act corruptly, what are the factors and the inhibitors of people engaging in bribery. And now one could ask, well, we do have a lot of information about fraud, for instance, embezzlement, and taking advantages, rule breaking in the private sector, but how does it differ? Does it matter? Do we need another scholarship that focuses particularly on the public sector and their context? While I could argue, yes, of course, because I work at the University of Bern Center for Public Management, and that's basically what we do. There's a general proposition in public administration research, namely that sector does matter. Sector as an institution is, for once, important to stir and direct administrative behavior, because sectoral institutions provide an ethical frame for decision making. A public sector and public organizations that are more strongly connected to governmental structures, to politics, but also they do have different goals. Normally they are in charge of spending taxpayers' money. They have to take into account what their decisions mean for the society at large. And one of the pillars basically of public sector research, public management, and public administration is that these organizational frames also guide behavior and decision making. For instance, regarding public service motivation. Public service motivation is a particular construct that we use very much, and that is helpful in explaining quite a lot of different phenomena related to employee behavior and self-selection into the public sector, namely one's individual proposition of having a commitment to public values, being more intrinsically motivated to self-sacrifice, for instance, to work for less pay in the public sector in order to fulfill what's one's value proposition, but also an interest in the general public's well-being, for instance. And there's also other values that might affect individuals' behavior when making decisions, ethical or unethical, in sector context. So what we think is that being aware of the context a decision is being made in, and taking into account individuals' public service motivation, but also their larger values like family values, religion, and so on, this might affect how likely they are to tolerate the use of bribery. Now, on the empirical evidence, we do know a lot that sector in itself as a cognitive frame, but also by legal guidance, for instance, does direct administrative behaviors. And we've known that for like 70 years, for instance, going back to Herbert Simon or the baselines of even Weberian bureaucracy. And also there are some mixed links related to ethical versus unethical behavior in the public sector in context. However, the relation to corruption research is rather small. So what we did is we raised professional samples among public sector employees from 4 developed and relatively low corruption countries, that is Switzerland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the USA. And we conducted a multinational vineyard-based quasi-experimental replication study in order to dive into this micro level of what might drive bribery tolerance. And the question is, does sectoral context influence decision makers' tolerance for bribery? And what is the role of the type of bribe and individual's value orientation? So we have a little bit of variation there. And one limitation, of course, might be, this is an experiment, so it's in a controlled environment. This is not hard data that we collected by observing something like we might do on a macro level, but we do use some psychological tricks to find out what people actually think and how they behave. So a little bit more about the theory that we use here. We model bribery as a multifaceted phenomenon that is related to dissimilar psychological mechanisms. And there's some work, for instance, by Ramdani, Ossipian, Chapman, and so on, that puts forth the idea that you can differentiate 3 different shades of corruption in general, or 3 different shades of bribery. Well, white bribery might be related to the bribe offerer using emotional and affective influence tactics in order to get his or her goal. That means that, for instance, begging or using positive relations, and there's not really money being paid. It's not the brown envelope, but still it might be very effective on getting to one's individual goals that might be, well, negative for the rest of society. So you're taking advantage from somebody who is in power. Then there's this gray area where you have a prospect of reciprocity, and you're also not really paying money, but still there is some kind of relationship that is being established, that most of society might be unsure on how to really justify this. So white bribery, most of society thinks that's still okay. While black bribery, where you really pay money in order to get a favor or better treatment compared to others, you cannot pay this bribe, will be regarded as something criminal. So we do have rather a spectrum in here between white, gray, and black shades. However, then there's on the other side situational action theory, who says people will most likely commit crimes if the setting is right. So if you have a certain context that allows them to rationalize their own behavior and then engage in, for instance, taking this bribe. So we think there's a connection here. To make this a bit shorter, we believe that individual value disposition, their morality, their public service motivation, their value orientation might function as a corrective inhibitor in the relation of their tolerance of bribery, so if they're being offered a bribe. However, sectoral context might matter, and these hypotheses don't really have a direction yet, because there's different ways on how to argue whether or not institutional frame might influence the adequacy of unethical behavior. So, for instance, we could assume that if people feel very strongly about public values, so they are really much into believing we are all sitting in the same boat, then a public sector context might inhibit any form of bribery, because they think this would be so unethical in order to engage in bribery in this kind of context, while in the private sector, it might be more acceptable. And just a short note on that. So theoretically, institutional theory suggests that publicness can be differentiated by different dimensions. For instance, legally, there's certain legal rules in each country that determines what is part of a public sector and what is not. In some countries, it's stronger than others. For instance, you have a private sector firm, like a share-based company. In contrast, you have institutions of the public, and there's often a kind of gray area in between, even more so in the last 20-25 years. So that's what we mean with a hybrid organization. For instance, also if people have multiple roles at the same time. So there's like also a gray area between these sectors. And we might assume that people who feel strongly about public values, for instance, high public service motivation, might be less likely to engage in bribery in the context of a public sector than in a private sector. And the idea would be there's a transitivity in there. So maybe it's highly acceptable or relatively highly acceptable to being bribed in the private sector compared to the public sector. So what did we do? This is a quantitative study based on vignettes that we used in an online quasi-experiment. We have 3 times 3 in total 9 treatments, and we replicated that in 4 different countries. This creates a relatively large sample out of civil servants, in total more than 1,800 participants, but people responded to more than one vignette, so that we have more than 3,000 observations in total. So that's quite good as a database. What we did is we created, using an expert panel and pre-testing and so on, we created scenarios where we asked people to put themselves into the shoes of, for instance, an officer, someone who is out on a negotiation for an international organization or trade deal, or somebody who is in charge of controlling restaurants, like in different areas and shades. One for each sector and one for each of the white, gray, and black bribery idea. Then we use a randomized trial in order to distribute these vignettes to our participants in each country, and also control for a lot of other side factors, for instance, the realism of these scenarios, but also the values, the religiousness, the risk propensity, age, gender, education, and so on of our participants. What we measure particularly is moral disengagement, public service motivation. These are standard scales, and we use a measure that is called tolerance of bribery by a paper that was pre-tested in a paper that is forthcoming right now. And what this looks like is, just to give you an example of a vignette. So we here have the gray type of bribery public sector vignette. So we asked them to imagine you work as a diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you are involved in negotiations regarding a very important international collaboration treaty that should eventually result in a free trade agreement between country you represent and a partnering country. And one day you're on a mission to a partnering country. As you arrive at your hotel, you find the keys of a very exclusive sports car lying on your bed, together with the message for fruitful collaboration between our countries. Just to give you an idea, and maybe this seems very on the top, but we actually pre-tested that with people who have similar positions in real life, and they thought, like, well, it's not so far off actually. If you want to, I can show you some other examples of the vignettes later, but that's just one. And the point here is, it's not a monetary transaction, because obviously if you're flying to another country, you can't take the car with you, but there is something going on. Like, if you accept this, if you engage in this form of influence, there might be, and that's what also neurological studies suggest, something is anchored in your brain and will frame your decisions, like a priming effect. And then the measure of tolerance of bribery is, after this vignette, we ask people, what would you do? And we ask them on 4 dimensions. How likely would it be that you, in this case, use the car? How justified would it be? How would it feel? So the affectivity of this situation, and would that be a mistake to have a reverse item? And we pre-test that with confirmatory factor analysis and use this measure before, and it works out fine. So I think that's a good dependent variable. And on another point, why do we use these countries specifically? Even though if now this looks very red and alarming, but actually the corruption perception index of the public sector, we wanted to have a little bit of a selection, not only having the top countries, top ranks. So one of the highest ranking ones is Switzerland, which is perceived as very low corruptly in the public sector. Then Hong Kong and USA are kind of in the middle ground, and Taiwan now looks very dark and gloomy, but actually the mean score of all of Europe, for instance, is also 65. So this is all still pretty good. So it's like first, third or fourth quarter of the whole list of 180 countries. So we have some variations, and we replicate our study in order to think a little bit hard about generalizability. So that's what we have. Lots of observations. It's all professional people, so just to have an idea, and they are all still inactive civil servants. What did we find? These are the marginal effects of tolerance of bribery by shade and sector. Most important thing is here, that's the pooled data. I also show you the separate ones soon. Sector does matter. We do see that for each public, private, and hybrid sector, weirdly, very weirdly, it is more acceptable to engage in darker shades of bribery than the emotional influence tactics. Just take a look here on the left-hand side. There's the tolerance of bribery scale. We should accept that it's the other way around, but absurdly, apparently it's more acceptable to use the darker shades, and it's not completely transitive. So we do find differences between sectors, but the differences are very small because the confidence intervals overlap quite a lot. And apparently in the hybrid sector, where it's a bit, this informality of white bribery, of influence tactics seems to be more acceptable. So that's quite surprising, I think. However, we also find very strong country effects. And now it's the same graph for each country, here Switzerland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and USA. It's interesting to see that the two Western countries have more similarity than the two Eastern countries, even though Hong Kong has, of course, a long tradition of being influenced administratively by the UK. But this should be a reminder that, first of all, we should make more replication studies, and it's hard to generalize from what we find so far. What I do see, though, is it is interesting that we do find different levels of acceptability that is quite stable through all the sectors for each of the type of bribe. So white, gray, and black bribery is regarded as very different concepts in the minds of the people that we asked to respond to our survey. And keep in mind, they are all professionals, so maybe there might be a slight bias towards the public sector because that's where they work in normally. But I found it particularly interesting that regarding the gray areas, the countries are so different. And we might be wary in, if we have research outcomes from Western countries, we might be careful, we might better be careful in generalizing them to other parts of the world, just as far as that. We had this other stream of thought. What was interesting was that all of the other values we measured, like family values, religiosity, and so on, didn't matter at all. What we did find is that this public service motivation I talked about so much actually does matter strongly, but only in the public sector. So if we look at people's response on the acceptability of bribery, people with low PSM, and that is just below the sample's medium, will be much more likely to accept bribery, any form of bribery in the public sector, while the people with high PSM, that's the dotted blue line, will be less likely so, and strongly less likely so. Well, we don't find the same effect for a hybrid organization context or a private sector context. Which is quite reassuring for us being researchers of public management, but still this is something important to keep in mind and strongly calling for more replications in more countries, I think. Just to sum it up, so we do see sector context matters for bribery tolerance. Specific acts of bribery will be regarded as less acceptable in public versus private sector organizations. And the gray area of hybrid organizations is particularly hard to grasp. Of course, this study has limitations because it's a relatively controlled quasi-experiment, but anyways, this gives us a stepping stone in order to go further. That I would interpret it in a way that this is where the dark magic happens, where we really have to go into more and understand more what's going on in these gray areas. Indeed, PSM moderates the relation between bribery shade and bribery tolerance, but only in the public sector context. So low PSM individuals will be significantly more likely to tolerate gray and black bribery in a public sector context, while those people who are very aware of their value orientation towards the public good. And last but not least, the strong country effects call for more comparative research. And although we find very strong and robust relationships between sector shade and micro-level bribery tolerance, they are very different across each country. So we should look into this much more to understand the between country differences. So, and this is where I say thank you very much. If you want to know more about our research project, go on this website, corpusproject.org. These countries are the countries where we replicate the study, or replicating right now. So we're trying to do exactly this and find out more about what's going on there. And thank you very much for your attention. Open for questions.
Thank you very much, Christina. And well, actually, I think the most appropriate things to do now is essentially to open questions for 8-9 minutes to the rest of the audience. And in case Jeremy has got some initial questions or comments, please welcome.
I've got one question in the chat. Shall we start with that one?
Yeah,
unless Jeremy wants to go first.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see the chat.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm here for that. So I'm just going to ask you that question, but I think it's from Randolph. But actually, I might abuse my position to elaborate on it. So the question from Jeremy is, why not include in the sample very corrupt countries too? And I think your last slide sort of, points at that as well. I mean, what I would add to that is, what was the comparative strategy behind it? I mean, I can see, why you would choose countries that are sort of similar, but you're now extending it to very different countries as well. I can see Russia, obviously, Ukraine, and so forth. So what's the comparative logic overall? Why did you start with the not so corrupt countries? And how is the fact that you're going to include very corrupt countries, in your view, going to affect the results? I mean, can you speculate a little bit on that, perhaps?
Thank you very much. And it's a very important question. So what you see in that slide is the blue countries are the ones from the first wave of this experiment or from this project. And we wanted to focus on countries that are normally regarded as developed and rather having little problems of corruption or seeing themselves as little corrupt. Now China is a bit of an outlier in there because it's like a mixed batch. But first we wanted to study countries that are, well, I would say having a blind eye on themselves sometimes, because the problem with the measures like the corruption perception index, for instance, that you read so often being cited, that doesn't show that there is no corruption, or it just shows you that people are not aware of it so much. And corruption, particularly in the public sector, can have different diverse forms. It's not only just graft or being bribed with monetary favors. It's also how the administrative burden is being distributed along the civilians. Who is getting preferential treatment? Who's for whom are the rules being broken? And now that we have that we know that this kind of works, and we find that there are clusters, basically. Just to sum it up, we find that administrative traditions like Central European Germanic or the Nordic traditions or UK, US, Anglo-Saxon versus Confucian has a strong predictive value in determining how people will respond. There's part of a response bias, of course, because in Asia you will find people normally will say no, everything's fine, everything will be more extreme in the way they respond to scales. But what we find is that you can basically cluster the world by their responses to these vignette scenarios, so in the sense. So, and now we're going into the second wave is the green countries, where we do all of the post-Soviet countries, or most of them. We're also going to go to Balkan, I think, quite soon. And so we're trying to compare their results with what's going on in the rest of the world.
Can I ask just a simple question, if I can?
Sure.
Yeah.
So basically, if I understood correctly, the participants are all employees from the public sector, no?
Yeah.
So my question is just very simple. So you know that there are papers, very famous papers in science and so on, showing that the identity affects dishonesty. So basically, if you think about your identity, depending on how that identity is commonly represented, so basically it's a stereotype or not, people behave more honestly or more dishonestly. So here, since you have all the identity and you ask people that are in the public sector to wonder how do they think about to behave in the public sector, question, do you activate something? Do you think so? And my question also is, how is there a difference between public employees asking to imagine their behavior in a public situation, and the same employee or similar employee asking or wondering how you have to behave in the private sector? I'm not sure if I'm clear.
Yes, you are clear. I think this is, for one point, this calls for even more research, like doing all of that stuff again with people working and being socialized in the private sector. What we do find is that the differences between the public and private sector treatment is smaller in countries where the distinction between the sectors is not as strict, where you don't have a career-based systems, for instance, where you can just switch in and out from career paths, while in others, like for instance Austria, Germany, and so on, you're a public servant for life basically, and you don't choose. We try to control for this socialization effect with public service motivation, because we think people self-select based on this, and there's quite a large literature on this, and by also replicating our study with students who are kind of business students and potentially going to the public sector one day but haven't decided yet. So, and there we basically get the same results from people who are not yet in socialized, career-based in one of the sectors or not. But yeah, of course, the effects or the preventive effect of the public sector in our results here, I don't know if I go back here, like I think this left-hand graph might be inflated. If we replicated that study with people who work in the private sector, maybe the differences might be reversed. So maybe they don't give a lot of thought about the public sector, but then in the private sector, they might say, okay, no, it's unacceptable. So yeah, there might be inflation basically based on socialization effect, based on identity that is being triggered. So thank you very much for this question.
Thank you. Sorry, can I just intervene a second, because there is one participant that told me that he cannot have access to all of the others, and he wanted to ask a question. So do you mind, Gerard, if I give?
Sure, I've got two other questions here as well, which were sent to me privately in the chat.
To send it privately. So, or we can choose one of them, and then the rest can be discussion for later on anyway. You you can go ahead, and then we can. There is time for another question, I think.
One other. Okay, so the first one I got was from Dr. Simsek. Do you want to unmute and ask the question orally? Oh, I can see it's now posted in the general chat. Or shall I'll just read it out then. So the question is, have the researchers done an inquiry into the motivations and values of public servants? And I got an additional one to that. If so, do they differ from country to country? And I think, Christina, you started answering that by saying that you've controlled for values, motivations.
Yes, that's a good point. They do differ across countries, but we do find this basically worldwide common thread of public service motivation, which is a quite powerful construct that our community has been working on since the 90s, I think. And you can, it captures quite a lot of why people choose the public service. And it works all around the world, except Singapore, because in Singapore you have like double you have a wage premium that is quite extreme compared to the private sector. That's a point where extrinsic motivations might play a large role. However, in most countries, self-selection into the public sector can be explained quite well by a particular set of values that is like can be subsumized by compassion, self-sacrifice for the plight of others, being interested in policy making, politics, and having a feeling about the public good and having a responsibility feeling on that. It's a more complicated construct, but we did measure that, we did control for this, and that's basically what's in this slide that you're seeing right now. PSM is this. Did you have another question, Gerard?
Gerard, there is another question that they sent it directly to me before. If you want, I can give it. I don't know if you have.
You're in charge of timekeeping. I've got another one, but
okay, perfect.
It's up to you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So the question was from Cornelia Weiss. Sorry, let me find again. What was the findings as to whether there was a difference between females and males? So a question about gender of respondents.
That's a good question, because there's a lot of research claiming that males and females are different. We do find, actually, it's a very small effect. So we don't have any effect regarding the religiosity and family values, and we don't have anything age related, but spoiler alert, women are more likely to act corrupt throughout all of our treatments in all the sectors, but it's a super small effect. It's only like in the clustered regression, it's like 0.04, but it's there, but it's very, very small. That might be related to a treatment effect in the sense, because we didn't really specify the person there being engaging in the vignettes, so we did have different treatments, or that I don't know. Like, honestly, I don't know what that is for, but we find it in all of the countries, and but it's super small.
Okay, so thank you very much, and we can keep on the discussion then later on. Now I think it's good to move to the second presenter. So Jeremy Sals and Guillermo Matu. They will talk about rent-seeking tournament with sabotage, fighting antisocial behaviors with envy. So Jeremy, please, it's the audience, it's all yours. I'm happy to share your PowerPoints.
Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen, but it's written that I cannot do it because it's forbidden for me.
I need to make you presenter. I forgot to do that, sorry. Here you go. Okay, should work now.
It is working.
Great.
Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Works for me.
All right, so thank you very much, guys, for this excellent workshop. I think it was great, and I enjoy watching the 4 workshops. And thank you for inviting me for presenting this paper. So this is a joint paper with Guillermo Mateu. Guillermo and I, we used to work in the same business school before, and we were working in the same, almost the same topics in experimental economics. And we are big fans of football, and you'll see why. And so the idea started by competing, because we are not a fan of the same teams, obviously. And so we are competing one against the other, and so you will see what happened. So the question is about rent-seeking tournaments, and you can have positive and negative actions, and the goal is to find a solution to reduce people's propensity to engage in sabotage. So let me give you a short idea about the motivation. So if you see, there are a lot of contexts in which there is competition, and sport is maybe a very good example. You have a lot of competition between the teams or between players. But when you watch football exhibition match or something like that, you see a lot of cooperation between people also. If you look at the Olympics, you have D'Agostino that was helping another female racer because she was injured, and she helped her to finish a race, even if she lose a race because of that. And if you look at the example, you have people that are supporting Trump, and they are friends with people supporting Biden. So it's not something that, so cooperation can be also the case. But in the same time, you have extreme examples in which people are competing, and they don't behave very very good way. So if you look at the first picture on the top of the screen, this is pig face that has been thrown in during a pitch of football between Barcelona and Real Madrid, because one player was in Barcelona and then he moved to another team that was Real Madrid, and this is not something that the supporters have accepted. And if you have watched the TV recently, or before the US elections, you saw a lot of images of people fighting one the other because they were supporting Trump and the other team was supporting Biden. So basically, you have a competitive settings. You can see examples of pro and antisocial behavior in the same time. And let me give you a smart video about that.
In a battle for the World Junior title. Now watch Machuca in the red vest. They don't like each other, these two, and you'll see why. What? that propelled him across the line. The second faster than it would have been if he hadn't punched him on the back of the head.
All right, so as here is a perfect example. You have people competing, and one because at the end he's failing to get the race, to win the race. So he's misbehaving, he's punching the other one. Okay, so this is a good example. And so if you look at the competition, traditionally competition is always seen as a positive thing. It enhances performance, so it's a good thing to introduce. If you introduce competition, that's better because people will work more and so on and so on. But on the same time, you have a literature showing that it can have this dark side also. It has negative sides, so it has negative effects. So I just quoted two very good papers about these negative effect of competition. The one is the first paper by Lorenz Grote in Management Science. So he's an experimental paper, but he's examining the effect of competition on pro and antisocial behavior at the same time between groups. And what we observe is that, okay, if you introduce competition, groups are performing better, but on the same time they are they're less cooperative and much more aggressive one against the other. So it's not something very positive. In the second paper, the paper by Gary Charnes in Management Science 2 years after, they have groups competing again, and what they observe is that the groups then can even sabotage others' actions to be better, to win the competition, or they can cheat to win the competition. And what they observe is that so of course competition increase performance, but it also increase the propensity of people to engage in sabotage and to cheat in order to increase their performance. So basically what I want to show you is that there is a dark side in competition, and competition promotes also performance, but it also promotes sabotage. So, and if you look at the relationship between competition, there is something strange appearing in competition. So you have in competition, you have scarcity of resources. Basically, you have one premium, one cash prize, or one bonus that is only awarded to the best performing guys or the best performing group. So basically, not everybody can get the bonus, and if you get the bonus, you have an advantage over the others. And if you look at the literature about that, this is clearly a context in which envy arises. So basically, what Aristotle says that we compete with those who follow the same ends as ourselves, and these are these people that we are bound to envy beyond all others. So there is a link. We see competition, it increases performance. We see competition, it also promotes negative behavior, and we see also competition. In competition, there is something that can arise very quickly and very easily. It's envy, and envy is often underlined as being responsible for these negative behaviors. So if you look at envy is an emotion that arises when you want something you don't have, and you see this advantage possessed by others. And so when you see these advantages, you don't feel very good. So there is a depressive state. So you don't feel satisfied. You're coveting for that advantage. And there is a call for action, basically. So you realize that people have something you want, but you don't have. And so basically, either it pushes you to make some constructive efforts to get that thing that you don't have, or it pushes you to make destructive efforts to destroy the advantage others have. Okay. And so it's interesting because the literature on envy has evolved a lot. And before 10 years ago, almost people said that envy was negative. And now there's this new trend of literature showing that envy is an emotion, and has an emotion, it has a call for action. And the action can be either positive, can be negative. It depends on how you channel the emotion. Okay, so it can lead to a very large variety of behaviors, and that's interesting. So the goal here is to show the impact of envy. And so there are two very beautiful papers, one two by the same authors, but one in organization science on the left. And this is a field experiment. So they watch the behavior of car inspectors in the US test emission market. And what they observe is that when they have very standard car, they are much more lenient toward the standard car rather than when they have to examine the prestigious cars. And why? Because they are experiencing envy. So basically, if you want to get if you want to pass the test, you have to buy a very standard car and not an expensive one, because with the standard car, they don't feel envy towards you. So they will be much more likely to be lenient to help you pass the test. And this is the opposite when you have a prestigious car. Okay, so don't buy a prestigious car. And on the right part of the screen, so it's a lab experiment, and so you have people going to the lab. They are walking by pairs, and so there is the first player that has to solve anagrams, and the second player that has to grade the anagrams. And the second player, he can lie, so he basically can be honest. So he's paid according to the performance. He can lie either at his advantage, so both will be paid better, more because he lies, or he can reduce the performance and they can both be paid less than what they should be paid. Okay. And so what they observe, so they created an heterogeneity in the players. Some players are poor, some players are wealthy. And you observe, if you can look at the right screen, there is the only case in which people lie to harm others. It's when there is a poor grader that is evaluating the performance of a wealthy solver. So basically, you are poor, you evaluate the performance of somebody that is richer than you, you feel envy, and because you are envious, you are willing to sabotage and to reduce the benefits of and the performance of your teammate. Okay. So this is the traditional view of envy. Envy is the following. So you see somebody with something that you want, and you're willing to sacrifice some resources to prevent the others from being above you. Okay. So this is the standard view. This is not the view that I do share. I think the envy is an emotion, and there is a lot of literature showing that envy is a call for action, and you can channel the emotion into positive ways or negative ways. So let me give you an example. So this is an experiment we did with my colleagues. So you have a cup here, an opaque with a cover on the top of it. You put a 6-faced dice inside it, and it's not a manipulated one. Close the cup by the cover, and you ask people to roll the dice and to report the outcome. Okay, and so you pay people according to the outcome. So if you get a 6, I pay you €6. If you get a 2, I can pay you €2. And this is a very clever game because you can get 2 and nobody will know that you get 2, and so you can inflate your readings and say, okay, no, I have 6, so pay me 6, please. And so this is very clever because you look at the distribution of reported dice readings, and you can say whether they are lying evidences or not, because normally it should be flat, it should be uniform, or people will get the same proportion of people will get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we don't observe that. Okay, so we did 3 treatments in the baseline, the BSL. You are alone and you are playing alone. In the symmetric, you're 2 players. You don't meet each other. You don't see the other player. But one is rolling the dice, and the other one is a passive decision maker, and both get the same payoff, according to the report of the first player. And the asymmetric treatment, you are 2 players, but the dice roller is getting is reporting, for example, 6. He gets €6, but the other one, the passive decision maker, we get twice his report. Okay, so we create an asymmetry and we generate envy. And look at what happened. So if you look at the results, in the baseline, people lie not so much, but they all increase the outcome by 1. In the symmetric also, because it gives a justification. I don't lie for me, I lie for the other. But in the asymmetric treatment, it's very nice because people refuse to lie anymore. So basically, they're willing to lie when they are alone. They're willing to lie if you get the same benefits. But as soon as you get more benefits than me from my own lies, I just refrain from lying. That's really cool. So basically, envy can push people to be very negative, as Gino mentioned and Gino underlined it, but it can push people to be honest also, because people are envious. So this is what we want to do. We want to show that we can use such an emotion to prevent people from being bad guys or sabotaging others and so on and so on. So this is the motivation of the paper. We have a context in which people are competing one against the other. They can be good guys and they can be bad guys, Of course, there will be bad guys, okay? And what we want to do is, rather than doing the standard thing about finding people when they are bad, we want to see, okay, you can do bad things, but if you do bad things and you're caught doing these bad things, then we will give an advantage to your competitor, okay? So we want to do that. So basically, it's the following. So the question we want to address is the following. We want to know whether people will be more or less likely to engage in counterproductive behaviors if others could benefit from the transgressions. Okay, so we have a very simple design. It's very simple, in which you can do bad things, good things. If you do bad things, in one case you are fine, but the fine is going to my own pocket, to the experimental pocket, so you get less money. That's all. But in the second one, if you do bad things and you're caught doing these bad things, you will be fine, but the fine will go to the competitor. Okay. So what we expect from the hypothesis is that if the sabotage can benefit to your competitor, then you're less likely to do sabotage. And so, as I told you, we did an experiment. So it's a laboratory experiment. So let me show you the laboratory experiment. It's a very simple one. So we have a proportional rent-seeking tournament. So basically, imagine you have a cash prize, a big cash prize, and you have tickets. And basically, the idea is that you will be paid, you receive a part of the cash prize depending on the number of tickets you have. Okay, so you have to buy as much as you can tickets. So it's a competition of buying tickets. And here we introduce a slight difference between the other papers. It's a tournament between groups of two people, between pairs. Okay, so we have one good guy in each team and one bad guy in each team. So, and we have two treatments. Okay, so I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So we have one treatment, one condition because the baseline, in which I'm going to show you the difference, and the other one in which we have this special mechanism relying on envy. And so people play that for 20 periods. They are paid, of course. It's really money, and they don't. So every time they interact with a new team, with a new pair, and so there is no learning. There's only learning, no reputation, and that's all. So let me explain you the game. It's quite easy. You will see. So there is a big cash prize. You have two pairs competing every period for this cash prize. This cash prize is always the same across the periods. It's 560 euros, EQs, so it's experimental currency unit. And so in each pair, you have a white player and a blue player, and both have different actions to make. The white player is the good guy, basically. He has to buy tickets to get the larger price or the larger share of the price. Basically, he has an endowment, 100 EQs. Everybody has his endowment, and he has to buy tickets, white tickets, to get a share of the price. So basically, the more white tickets you have, the largest part of the price you have. Okay, so it's a competition. So the two players from opposing teams, they are two white players, and they have to buy as much as they can white tickets. And the cost for one ticket is one experimental currency unit. So this is positive action. And for the blue players are the bad guys. Okay, so imagine you're a blue player from the first pair, from pair A. You have the possibility, you cannot buy white tickets because this is for the white player. You can buy blue tickets, and blue tickets are the very bad tickets. Basically, by buying a blue ticket, I reduce the number of white tickets purchased by the opponent team. Okay, so I reduce the probability for the opponent team to win more money from the prize, to get a larger price or share of the prize. So basically, it's like burning. So the opponent can buy white tickets, and you as a blue player, you can burn the number of white tickets purchased by the opponent team. So you increase your share of the prize. So basically, it's the same price for a blue ticket and a white ticket. So it's one experimental currency unit, but there is a slight difference here. So being naughty in person is not really accepted. So basically, here is you have the probability of being controlled and being fined. So basically, there is a 0.5% probability that increases with your number of tickets. So basically, if you buy the largest number of blue tickets, you have one chance out of two to be detected and fined. So if you get detected, you will be fined because you don't have to purchase and to be naughty with other people's. And so you have to pay a fine. And the difference between the treatments is who gets the money, who will get the money of the fine. Okay. So if you understood clearly, you have white players do positive actions. They buy tickets so as to increase the share of the price. And you have blue players, negative actions. They can reduce the number of white tickets purchased by the opponent team. But blue players can be fined. Okay, so the more they engage in destructive decisions, the more they can be visible, it can be obvious, and the more they can be fined. Okay, and the fine is always the same case in both treatment is the same amount, is 200 EQs, so it's like 0.5 euro. So it's not working anymore. Yes. So basically, the fine is very important. Only the fine has to be paid by blue players. At the end of each round, you receive information about the number of blue tickets you purchase, the number of white tickets you purchase, your team purchase, the number of blue tickets purchased by the opponent team, also the white tickets and the blue tickets, whether you have been fined, whether the opponent has been fined, and the payoff, and your payoff and the opponent's payoff. And so this is the payoff determination. So basically, we split the price into two, and it depends on how many tickets the relative number of white tickets you purchase. And so the manipulation is the following. So basically, if you understand clearly, you have white players that can purchase tickets to increase the share of the price. You have blue players within a team that can purchase tickets to decrease the opponent's share of the price. The part of the price is shared equally between members of the pair, and the blue players, only the blue players, can be fined if they are caught purchasing blue tickets. And the manipulation is the following. So in the baseline treatment, the fine goes to the experimenter. So is subtracted from the game. And in envy, the fine goes to the competing pair. Okay, so basically, if you get fined, you have to pay 200 EQs, and this amount will be shared equally between the two players or the opponent team. And so what we believe is that there will be less sabotage in the envy treatment rather than the baseline treatment. So I hope I was clear. If that was not clear, you can ask me a question right now, and I will be able to answer it, because then after it's not. If you don't understand the manipulation, it doesn't make any sense to go forward. So let me give you a very quick overview of the design. So it's a very simple experiment. Okay, so let me give you so what we expect here is that since envy is a strong motivation, most people experience envy. It can push people to be positive, or can push people to be negative. Here we expect people to be much more inclined to be more pro-social, less antisocial with envy. So this is what we observed. Here we have the okay, so basically, what we show is that so if you look at the constructive actions, so constructive actions is the number of white tickets purchased by white players. We observe a small increase in the envy treatment. So basically, it's like competition is much more intense in the envy treatment, but this difference is not significant. What is rather distressing for us is that we expected envy to reduce people's propensity to behave negatively. And what we observe, if we compare the number of blue tickets, the bad tickets, purchasing within each condition, we observe that people are purchasing much more white tickets, blue tickets in the envy treatment than in the baseline treatment. And that difference is significant. So basically, when you ask people, okay, no, if you get fined, the fine goes to the competing to your river, we expected less sabotage, we observe more sabotage. So we were distressed and crying at that moment. And this is obvious. You can look at the data, it's really obvious. So now maybe there is an effect of envy. So we looked at across players. So we did some analysis on the white players. We did some analysis on the blue players to understand what happened, because we were very distressed about these results. So let me show you some results. So we did some panel data regressions. And what we observe is that for the white players, so the constructive actions, the white tickets, envy does not affect anything. So there is no effect of envy. Where there is an effect, because if you look at the, it's very standard in the rent-seeking game.
Jeremy, sorry if I interrupt you. You got 1 minute.
Yes, I will be very quickly. So basically, what it happens with the envy treatment is that it reduces the sensitivity to retaliate. Basically, what we observe in the standard games, people retaliate. Here, we don't observe this effect with envy. And with the blue players, we observe an effect of envy, and the pushes people to be much more to engage in much more sabotage. But it also reduces the probability to be retaliating guys. So basically, if you attack me, I will not be more likely to attack you if I experience envy, if there is this envy mechanism. So to summarize, we have this result. We found no effect on positive actions, but a positive effect in negative actions. So this is not this is counterintuitive. We find that fine has an effect on deterring sabotage. We find that envy reduces sensitivity to retaliate, and that's a good thing also, and it reduces the sensitivity to retaliate for both positive and negative actions. So I will just stop here. I'm just showing you what I'm doing right now as an experiment, because I was really distressed by doing these experiments. So now I'm focusing on I think, a much more promising avenue of research. So let me show you my new research right now. I'm working on cats. So if you want to do cat behavior experiments, you can contact me. I have a lot of cats for doing experiments, and they are much more willing to participate in experiments. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And okay, so let me share instead the feedback that Michael sent. So let me see. Share. Okay. Here we are. Found it. So I hope you can see my screen.
You can make it maybe
bigger, right? Yes.
bigger, yes.
Yeah, I will. Here we are. Perfect. So essentially, these are some of the key points that he sent us, but he also sent quite detailed feedback that we will send directly to Jeremy on his paper. Unfortunately, he cannot be here now because he is, again, as I said, for unforeseen circumstances, he is on a plane. So I will talk on his behalf. It's quite an honor and quite a good responsibility, but I will read the key points, and Jeremy, you might have like a few minutes if you want to summarize some of your reflections about these key points. So related to the latent punitive and compensatory damages, or to the latent temptations, bundling and externalities in PG games, these are the points. Explain better the design choice of limiting one player to one type of actions, white tickets, and the other player to the other type of action, blue tickets. Is that important for external validity or for better identifying the effect? And then the other point, explain why the blue tickets are labeled as destructive. Do they lead to an overall welfare loss? Since the total number of blue tickets purchased is also in the denominator of the profit functions, it seems to me they only affect the share as to the white tickets, but not the absolute size of the pie. Another point, if you're thinking of expanding your experimental design, an interesting avenue could be to think about the complementarity, suitability of redistribution and monitoring in terms of producing or reducing sabotage. And last, currently your main treatment comparison suggests a positive treatment effect, but in your regressions you find a more subtle and less cleanly identified negative effect. I would suggest not to push the latter effect too hard, but rather try to identify the conditions in additional treatments that determine the size and sign of the effect. Example as suggested in point 4. And of course, finally, I really enjoy reading the paper and I regret not being able to discuss it in virtually or alter ego. Personally, though, you keep me posted. So this is essentially the slides of the reflection. So Jeremy, if you want to intervene and you want to give us like a general reflection about it, please, you have like a few minutes.
Yeah, so I will send a message to Michael, so just to thank him for making this discussion, these comments. So I think I will explain you why we chose to have these blue players with blue tickets and white players with white tickets. Because we were thinking about football, okay? So it's a beer paper, basically. We thought of we discussed this paper during beers, And basically what we wanted to do is to have something that is really close to what happens when you are watching a football match at the stadium. You have your team that is competing on the pitch, okay, and they are doing efforts to win the match. And you have the supporters, the fans that are around you. They are not with you, but they are around you, and their performance can also help you. You can push people. You can reduce the performance of your competing team, of your rival team. So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to have two different groups, two different individuals to have define the supporters that can be negative because because of their activities they can reduce the performance of the opposing team. But we also wanted to have some people that could only do positive things. Okay, white and players. So this is what we've done this kind of design. So I label blue tickets as destructive, but we did not did this mistake in the experiment. Of course, it was very neutral. We say you can just reduce the number of blue tickets and increase the number of. So it was very neutral in the experiment. I say destructive because I want people to understand it clearly, and that's all. But it's true. It's true. It's not something that affects the efficiency. And that's true. Indeed, it increases the efficiency. So if you look at the efficiency, people are much more efficient with envy or with the competition and envy mechanism. But what we wanted to do is to reduce, and maybe it's true, maybe Michael is true, we should focus on the efficiency issue and not on the sabotage issue. So I think it's a nice comment. And of course, the regression, we rush a lot to write the paper. So we wrote the paper in 4 days. And of course, the regression analysis it's a very first draft of the regression analysis, and we will do better on the end. So that's what I think.
Thank you so much. So stop sharing, and well, we can keep the time for the discussion later, and essentially we can move then to the paper of Joka and Michael, so governance in regions and cities.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, even though I have no chance of competing with forthcoming research on cats. But let me try to talk a little bit, zooming out from the discussion of vignettes and experiments to governance and municipalities and regions. So this worked for us primarily on what was one of the chapters of last year's EBRD transition report, looking at governance with this chapter with Michael focusing on municipalities and regions. But I thought that given the current context, I would also update this a little bit with what this means for the role of governance in the current context of the pandemic, which draws very much on this year's transition report on the role of governance. So you can see a board game in my first slide, and that's because the way I talk about governance here is as a sort of rules of the game, the incentives and constraints economic and political actors are subject to, very much in the sense of the quality of institutions. So I will provide a very brief overview of governance at the country level, but then for most of it, I will zoom in on governance at the regional and local level, and then finish with a few slides on the increasing or possibly increasing role of governance in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will refer to the EBRD regions, which is broadly sort of Estonia to Egypt and the Slovak Republic to Mongolia, many of them transition or post-communist economies, which entered the 90s with relatively weaker levels of governance than countries at comparable levels of development, despite higher levels of human capital. And even though they have made large improvements since, they lag behind comparator economies as well as advanced economies to this day. So this governance gap that you can see in this chart remains in a range of indicators, and is especially pronounced when asking people about their perceptions of governance. And we generally think of governance as a country level characteristic, but it actually varies substantially, not just across countries, but also within them. So for instance, some regulations may be set at the regional or local level. People's perceptions of governance may depend on their interactions with the police or hospitals or schools in their specific area. We can see variation and quality of governance as measured using these ECI scores, which are measures of the European Quality of Government Index at the subnational level. You get north-south divide in Italy, see substantial variation even in countries like Spain, Bulgaria, or Romania, for example. What is interesting is that we actually see more variation within countries that have on average, weaker levels of governance. So towards the left here, you see Bulgaria and Romania with significant within-country variation in their quality of governance. For instance, Sofia and Bucharest's level of governance is comparable to that of Bratislava, but the rest of the country lag behind. Well, on the other here you see the Nordics, Germany, UK, the Netherlands, with high average levels of governance, but also relatively less variation in the quality of governance within countries. Now, you might think that some regions are able to first improve their institutions and quality of governance, and the rest then catches up as this good governance trickles down. But actually, we see over the period that we have these ECI indicators between 2010 and 2017 that the variation within countries in terms of the quality of governance has actually increased. Furthermore, we find that regional governance actually has large effects, even when keeping country-level institutions and country-level governance unchanged. So here, in order to try to mitigate the reverse causality that governance could lead to higher growth, but higher growth could also facilitate improvements in institutions, or conversely, you may believe that crises trigger improvements in institutions. So we try to mitigate this causality for higher governance. So this one to exploit the persistence in institutional arrangements, and specifically we look at whether a region belonged to the Ottoman, Habsburg, Russian, or Prussian Empire. We use this to instrument governance today to then look at the effect of this on regional growth today. And we estimate actually fairly large effects. So for example, I've zoomed in on the map of Romania here, improving governance from the level of its worst performing region to the level of governance in its best performing region would increase annual growth in that region by 1.7 percentage points. Now, this actually is a very large effect, and it's larger than the improvements we've seen over time within this data set. If we look at the largest successful improvements in the quality of governance at the regional level between 2010 and 2017, it would get you about a percentage point in terms of positive growth effect. Nonetheless, this is very significant if you relate it over time. But perhaps even more interesting is that how regional governance affects. Here we draw on the Financial Times FDI Markets Database, which is a project-level database of greenfield FDI investments. The dots, you can see the 500 most recent projects in a set of emerging European countries. And we use these to map these to the regional level and to regional governance from these ECI indicators that I mentioned earlier to try to look at how regional governance affects the location decisions of firms in a range of sectors. So these would include, for example, car or car component manufacturing plants in the Slovak Republic, as well as business service centers or logistics spread across the region. We find that the quality of regional governance indeed matters for foreign direct investment, and it's especially important for capital-intensive projects, so typically larger projects that have large capital expenditures that are more difficult to relocate. So in line with this, the effects are driven by sectors such as transportation. They're much less important for sectors like retail. And we find that they hold up even when controlling for other regional characteristics that we know influence FDI inflow, such as the level of human capital in the region. So far, this suggests that there could be substantial benefits from improving regional governance, even when country-level institutions and governance are unchanged, in terms of higher regional growth, better firm performance, or attracting foreign investment. So I would like to use my remaining time to look a little bit, and this is of course based on preliminary data and more tentative, at what this implies in the context of the current pandemic, where I think that based on our early results, the importance of governance may actually increase further as there's increasing demand for state intervention and for public sector employment. And this may follow up on some of the themes that Christina mentioned in her presentation. So states' ability to deliver on the expectations of the population depend on both the available fiscal space, but also administrative constraints. This scatter plot builds on ideas that were raised in a recent IMF report that looked at countries' policy options, which you can see described here, sort of in the four corners, depending on the city. So we try to change to this and operationalize them by creating an index of fiscal space, which captures a country's level of borrowing, debt, interest payments, as well as revenues, and a measure of administrative capacity, which captures things like the level of e-government, apologies for the clock in my background, doing business, as well as world governance indicators. And you can see advanced economies as blue dots towards the right here, which generally have high levels of administrative capacity, but quite a range in terms of fiscal space. For instance, the US at the bottom here, given its high levels of debt, to the Nordics with most policy options towards the top right. Countries in the EBRD regions and more generally middle-income economies, many of them have significant amounts of fiscal space. But what may be more binding for middle income and especially low income economies is their administrative capacity. So, for instance, in the context of the current pandemic, well, most governments have seen increasing fiscal space in recent years as their revenue increase and the borrowing still is fairly low for many economies. Administrative capacity constraints were often binding. For instance, in order to implement targeted support, such as the wage subsidies that we've seen introduced in many advanced economies, governments would need to be able to make digital payments to all eligible adults. However, while the use of bank accounts is fairly universal in advanced economies, you can see shares over 90% here, this has increased significantly in many emerging markets, but remains far from universal, with levels around 1/3 of the adult population in some countries in Central Asia or the southern and eastern Mediterranean. In line with this, if you look at some of the early policy responses we've seen in some emerging markets, many of these were second best in the sense that several Central Asian countries, for instance, introduced price controls as a way to try to protect the purchasing power of the poorest because more targeted policies were difficult to implement. We've seen pension increases in a number of economies, for instance, in the Western Balkans, not because pensioners were particularly hard hit by the economic effects of the pandemic, but simply because these were a type of policy that was easy and quick to implement given administrative constraints. Now, administrative constraints also matter more generally. And here we wanted to see what role they play for state intervention or how services, whether you think of municipal utilities, public transportation, or provision of broad internet are provided. We see that direct provision through state-owned enterprises is more common where administrative capacity constrains private sector options. Because even though many of these could be made through various partnerships with the private sector, such as public service obligations, these would need to be set up and monitored and enforced. And this requires administrative capacity. So you can see towards the left of this chart, again, several economies in Central Asia or the Western Balkans where administrative capacity constraints are more binding, and it is more likely that many of these services are provided through state-owned enterprises directly, with correspondingly higher share of employment in the public sector and state-owned enterprises. Now, we've seen a wave of privatizations over the last 30 years, and generally employment by the state, in particular in post-communist economies, has been declining. However, we see even before the pandemic that support for public ownership has actually been growing. So if you first look at the two dashed lines, these show the share of the population who say they are in favor of expanding public ownership. And this is shown by birth cohort. So you can see that in the post-communist socialist economies, this is substantially higher among older cohorts. So for instance, someone born in the 1930s would be much more supportive of public ownership than someone born in the 1950s or 60s. But what is striking here, and now if you look at the two solid lines, is that both of these have seen a shift up over time. So relative to this wave of the World Value Survey, which was done in the mid-1990s, if you look at the most recent data point done between 2017 and 2020, support for public ownership across all cohorts has increased both in advanced economies and in post-communist countries. And there is some tentative evidence that the pandemic may further increase demand for public ownership. So previous epidemics have reduced trust in economic institutions and democracy. And this is a recent paper by one of my colleagues at EBRD. Earlier work has shown that those who reach adulthood during major recessions are also more favorable towards public ownership. So here we looked at how support for public ownership varies among those who may have been exposed to epidemics earlier in their life. And we find that for those who had experiences of epidemics during their formative years, so ages 18 to 25, they tend to be more supportive. And this is driven by effects in democracies and generally in high-income countries. So there seems to be a sense that demand for public ownership increases significantly, but that people want to make sure that this larger state indeed represents their interests and is well governed. Now, demand for public sector employment may also increase given people's recent experiences in the labor market. And here it seems to be the case that those working for the public sector are better shielded than those in private sector employment. This scatter shows you changes in Google searches for unemployment and benefits against the share of state employment. You can see that where state employment is more important, seems to be less increase in interest in unemployment and benefits. This is very indirect evidence that we had early on based on Google searches, but EBRD did a survey jointly with the IFO Institute in August 2020, and this corroborates these findings. So there too, we find that those who were working for the public sector at the start of the pandemic in February 2020 were less likely to lose their jobs than those working for private sector companies. So this suggests that going forward, demand for state provision of services and demand for state employment may increase. So this makes the on various inefficiencies and governance issues in state enterprises, and making them more important when the role of the state increases to make sure that it represents the interests of everyone in society. So let me stop there and just show you the links if you would like to read more about any of this. These are the two transition reports that I mentioned that this work was drawing on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. So I'm going to give you then the audience to Julia for discussion. So Julia, please, you have 8 to 10 minutes for discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Luca, and thank you, Joka, for presenting your paper. Actually, your work based on two contribution to transition report. So I think I'll follow actually the practice established in previous weeks within this workshop to also share my discussion slides. Hold on a second. Hopefully it's going to work. So can you all see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So, and I think I'll start with actually briefly summarizing the main findings and then maybe offering some comments and suggestions. So as already Joka mentioned, basically this work is based on Hill and also Michael's contribution to transition reports, more specifically focusing on governance and zooming the focus then on regions specifically. So why focusing then on quality of governance is important? As Jacques already said, so basically governance here is look more sort of from the institutional perspective, being sort as sort of set of rules of the game, formal, informal, which either can constrain economic agents' activities or say stimulates them to maybe invest their efforts in sort of more high value adding productive activities with further contribution, more potential contribution to growth. So just to briefly summarize then, poor governance itself, it increases uncertainty and respectively transaction costs, this sort of negative implication for growth. Also damages competitiveness, rise inequality in all different, across all different aspects, including like access to opportunities, resource allocation, and as well as drives income inequality. And all this also have then respective consequences for increasing the dissatisfaction with institutions and leading to some maybe unexpected electoral outcomes as well. So as actually last year transition reports show across different levels, countries, regions and firms, then improving actually governance quality would render economic and social benefits. And this is measured in different ways, so through economic growth, productivity growth, and in terms of social outcomes, it looked from the perspective increase in satisfaction in the quality of life, and also reducing the probabilities and for people to immigrate to other countries when they're dissatisfied with the quality of governance. Right, so why then zooming the focus on actually regional governance? If we see that cities, regions are largely bound by actually national regulations, and so there is no variation across national regulations. Actually the work here clearly shows that we observe then heterogeneity in institutional quality, not only across countries, but also within countries. And these actually disparities are large and also growing over time. So I think Joka presented in her slides actually this map showing actually differences in European quality index of governance, but with actually some advanced economies experiencing the value higher than 50s. In some countries, it's not straight away visible to see these differences within countries. So I think in the report there is another graph offered actually that maybe more visibly presents the differences across regions. So you can see on the right-hand side here, the also split countries between economies of the EBRD region and also advanced economies. And you can see like the average is depicted by the dashed lines for the country, and then you can see also the differences between a best performing region and worst performing region as depicted by red circle line and then diamond green symbols. So the differences are high, observed across a number of actually countries. In Bulgaria, these disparities are particularly sharp, and also in Romania. Moving to advanced economies, Italy is a notorious example, but also Spain and I think Belgium. So why then we observe these different disparities within countries? It's largely driven then by decentralization of responsibilities to lower level of government, but at the same time, why they're increasing over time, as I think the authors make a point in their report, is that we also observe still, say, for example, some funding decision, allocation of funding being still pretty much centralized. So there is a bit of controversy here. Also, we observe the national regulations affecting basically this region in different ways through enforcement mechanisms. So there is a variation in enforcement across actually regions. There is also a variation in provision of services from region to region, and that's basically the main sort of factors which drives these intra-country disparities. What the authors also emphasize is that the quality of governance basically varies more within countries with actually weaker average governance observed at the level of a country itself. Right. So then actually the authors move on with trying to estimate regional economic benefits of good governance. And just to briefly summarize some of the findings, so they find that on average then the dividend would be equivalent to 1 percentage point per annum growth assessed by better firm performance if, say, regional governance improves. In Romania, they say specifically the case of Romania, when says the quality of governance improves from the level of the worst region to the best performing region. So it renders actually the dividend equivalent to 1.7 percentage points. So they also observe some, they calculate the benefits over time as well. And actually, it hasn't been mentioned in the presentation, but it's in the chapter of the report. They also look at how then the governance, regional governance affects firm level employment growth. Here they talk more about sort of associations because they don't address like a reverse causality issue, and similar they show like some positive effect on employment growth equivalent, say in Poland, to 2.2 percentage points. Jorgensen also showed that regional governance then also would affect decision of firms to locate. So here then regions effectively competing between each other to gain foreign direct investment. And also they affect individual decisions, and more specifically, the assessment then is done in the context of the decision to immigrate to other regions. Should say, for example, the confidence in governance stay at the same level. So the improvements then clearly renders the benefits in terms of reducing the likelihood of immigration by 1 percentage point, like they show in the case of Bulgaria, for example. And finally, actually, the study extends the discussion to view at the role of the governance in the context of COVID, and also showing basically there is a anticipated increased role of governance in the context of COVID and increased demand for state intervention. Now, to offer some actually points, maybe for the discussion, but also to just reflect on this presentation. When the authors assess the regional gross dividends, so they use the World Bank Enterprise Survey data for 2018-19, and this data is matched then with different data sources, but more importantly with European Quality of Governance Index, which they use to actually reflect then the regional level of governance. So since it's basically cross-sectional data, they face a problem of unobserved heterogeneity, but also reverse causality between the quality of governance and also growth at a regional level. So what they do, they employ instrumental variables and more specifically using former empires data in order to address this reverse causality issue. So my question is more about an instrument, to what extent then it vary at a regional level, because over time you would expect then maybe the boundaries would change of the country itself. And then also whether, say, what I was not clear about when they report the regional growth gains, we observe quite substantial differences in using some of the measures for institutional quality between OLS estimators and then using instrumental variable techniques. These differences could be perfectly justified, but also the literature suggests that they may be driven by or generated by invalid instruments. So in this case, I just wanted to ask what sort of diagnostic checks were done in order to then validate the instruments. And so if perhaps Jorka then can elaborate more on this at the end of this of my presentation. Similarly, when there is an assessment done of a cumulative dividend, gross dividend, so I wanted to ask how to you exactly interpret then this. So if we talk about then Hungary, so is it expected that if we hold other things constant and just keep improving then the regional governance index, so it would then bring Hungary to the level of Spain, in sort of help Hungary to close the gap with Spain in income. I just looked at 2018 data, and GDP per capita gap in Hungary vis-a-vis Spain was estimated as roughly equivalent to 25%. So I'm just wondering if my understanding of interpreting this finding is correct, that it would take Hungary about 45 years and to close this gap. It would be nice if you can explain more then. On this. So another thing that I wanted to ask with regard to this specific empirical exercise is to what extent then you account for special dependence here, and specifically when you discuss this trickle-down effect, which is supposed to be positive, like say if some regions adopt like best practices, so and this contributes to the positive growth performance, to what extent and this sort of spreads to other regions in terms of adopting similar good practices. Or you can reverse the argument by looking at it from sort of special contagion effect of bad governance practices. Since we observe then this increase in disparities, regional disparities over time, so I wonder then whether we observe then this contagion effect of bad governance practices to some extent. So it would be interesting to see what you do in order to account then for special dependence. On the second empirical exercise that you report also in your presentation, you look at to what extent then improvement in regional governance helps them to attract greenfield foreign direct investment. And specifically you focus on the greenfield FDI projects using, I think, Financial Times data. And what you find that basically there is a positive association between the two. And in fact, if I look at this, like controlling for corruption render quite substantial, actually positive effect here. My question is, since I haven't seen much of the discussion of actual empirical exercise within the report, sorry if I have missed it, but I just found it about sort of what sort of methods you use, because my understanding was that you haven't treated it as more sort of count data, and so I thought maybe like using perhaps Poisson model, zero inflated model, given that some regions perhaps attract zero projects, would be quite robustness checks. Maybe you already have done it, so it would be interesting also what you respond on this. Also, I found here that one of the results that you find that there is a negative effect of capital city. So if, say, capital is located in a region, which we consider as attracting this greenfield investment project. So in this case, the effective negative, so they're likely to attract then FDI projects. And I wonder how you would explain it. I mean, if you just forget about costs, from the corruptive perspective, there are some studies, I think Campanta and Doe published in American Economic Review has found that the corruption level in capital cities would be lower compared to actually other metropolitan cities, given that there are different accountability mechanisms working in place, like media coverage, for example, it's strong in capital cities as opposed to other metropolitan cities. But here you control for corruption. Okay, so I would assume that maybe we are just observing sort of type of FDI coming to these different regions, and perhaps they are more sort of cost efficiency gain seeking rather than, say, market seeking. So maybe you can also elaborate more on this funding. And also, I think you can impose various project controls. So maybe if you can mention some of them, because I haven't seen much of the discussion of this. Other things actually to consider.
Julia,
I'm finishing, it's the last slide.
Okay, thank you,
So,
sorry.
yeah, it's just the last to finalize. Since you make a big point about the role of decentralization, maybe there is some controversy about decentralizing some of the decisions, but then keeping the controlling of the funding at the central level. well. So to what extent maybe it was controlling for this. Also, access to different media sources to look at it from the accountability mechanism. And very important to look also, I think, at digitalization that I thought was missing at this stage at your work. And more specifically, for example, how then digitalization or access to internet media could mitigate some negative effect of poor governance. You do this partly in your extension of work in this report this year by including also this e-government financial inclusion into the index of administrative capacity. But I thought that it was actually looking at it as unbundled because e-government financial inclusion could be complementary to, say, other governance mechanisms, but it could be also substituting, like positively mitigating when we deal with poor governance in the first place. And talking about financial inclusion, just to give you an example, I mean, here you look at it as facilitating state support provision, but just citing a recent example of Belarus, where there is a political unrest, there the government is using it as an instrument, actually. They're writing off from people accounts any financial supports that come from outside as part of international aid, if, say, these workers protest, take part in the process, and they use this as cash to replenish basically their budget. They also authoritatively just write off also some cash from the accounts of those who are fined, and then actually come up with different sort of fine schemes on a daily basis, including them every single day without no justification. But it's just one of the ways to use this instrument to replenish the budget rather than to help, say, the population. So we have to be cautious about increased engagement then of state, and in some contexts it may cause, as I believe, more threats than can be the benefits. So it's just my message at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Actually, Joka, probably now we can open the discussion to the entire audience, and then if we got a few minutes, then at the end, if you want, you can summarize some of the reflection of Julia in case. But I would like to broaden a little bit more the discussion because the three papers were, the three presentations are very, very interesting. So, Gerard, I give you the power of the moderation.
So I've got two questions on the first two papers and 2.5 on the third, and I'll go in order. I start with the first paper. So a question from Guy Gysis. Do you maybe want to ask it orally about public-private sector division?
Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, hello, thank you. Thanks for presentation. It was really good. I like it. So I just noticed that the only division is public and private sector. So I wonder if the paper also approaches like subsectors of each sector, public and private ones. So they have very heterogeneous subsectors, yeah. And then how this would have affect these results. I was thinking, for example, if energy intensive sector, for example, in public sector, let's say in example of Russia, they are going to do so soon, I hope. And how would this affect their this white, gray, and black approach bribery? Thank you.
Before you answer, Christina, perhaps Jeremy's question is sort of related. It's a very short one, so I'll just add it myself, which is that he wonders how organizational culture affects the results as well. So, and I think it's sort of a broader question about, sort of the firm level, organizational level heterogeneity in your sample.
Absolutely. So thank you for these questions. I think they relate to two quite distinct processes that might go on in people's minds when they evaluate a situation where they're in the threat of engaging in unethical behavior. So the first thing, the subclustering of the sectors, totally agreed. So if you want to make a very precise prediction, you might have to look at a very small subsector. Regarding the public sector treatment, we now looked at administrative corruption, like public administration, and not just the whole potpourri of potential publicly owned firms, like also, I don't know, the building companies and electricity and what might, or education, but we focus on administrative processes. So we're quite confident that it still fits regarding the treatment. However, if you take into account that these, like regarding generalizability, if you look at the sectors as being strongly subdivided, that's the point also where organizational culture might explain differences if you looked at them, because what we saw also in other studies is that your value proposition that you hold within yourself is very strong, but then the most immediate corrective or accelerator of unethical behavior is your team, your immediate or your family life, but also your team that you work with. So if you have a bad boss, if you experience bad leadership, unethical leadership, this will promote you letting go of all boundaries. So I think organizational culture is extremely important, but that's where we close the loop, because actually there's a lot of research that shows that cultures differ profoundly between the different institutions by sector. So I think it's a work of bricks that have to be put together, but we've now scratched a little bit from the underbelly, I would say, and we have to build bigger models and better explanations by looking at all the other factors as well.
Thanks very much, Christina. In the interest of time, I suggest we move on to paper 2, because there are 3 questions now for that one. And again, in the interest of time, I'll just summarize 2 really interesting questions by Umut and Christina Zimmermann. So the question Umut asks is whether your experiment sort of prevents people from thinking about admiration as a alternative to envy. So people, when they're faced with better and richer people, do not necessarily experience envy, but in social psychology, there's admiration as an alternative emotion. And Christina's question relates to that. How can you be sure that it's envy that drives it and not another emotion? So Jeremy, do you want to react to these 2 questions?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I'm gonna first focus on the last one. So how do I know that it's envy? I don't know. I ask questions at the end, but the problem is that it was an experiment in French, and in French the word envy is difficult to assess. It's not the emotion, so it was complicated. So yes, we have some additional measurements about whether people believe it was more competitive, and what we observe is that the same game is perceived differently when you modify the fine recipient. Okay, so in the envy treatment, people perceive the game as more competitive than in the baseline treatment. And so the assumption is that as they perceive the game as more competitive, the game is the same, but they perceive the game as more competitive. Maybe this is why we observe slightly more white tickets and much more blue tickets, because they were much more intensively engaged. But we don't ask people about to rate their emotions or their emotional states. It's much more about some open questions. And so yes, I cannot go further in that direction. I cannot precisely say that this is envy. The second question. About admiration, yes, it can. Well, I think these are 2 very similar emotions. I agree, and I don't think in my treatment there should be admiration, because for admiration to arise, you need to do something that gives you the advantage, and people observe what you did, and they say, "Oh, you deserve what you did." And here there is no deserve. There is nothing. So basically, maybe this is why we don't have. But I really believe that if we don't observe this result, it's because we have some competitive additional measurement or element, and because people perceive this competition as more intense, they would be more likely to behave negatively. So I agree, admiration should be interesting also. The last question Christina just raised, or maybe she raised it before, is it realistic to prospect theory? I think prospect theory is always almost everywhere involved, no? So it's true. We can put prospect theory there. I agree. But these are very nice questions. I agree, and thank you all for these questions. I will try to answer more by answering an email to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeremy, for these initial reactions. So let's move on to the third paper for the questions that were posted in the chat. So to Joka, Luca Uberti asks whether the EQI measure of citizens' trust is in public institutions, or is it a perception-based measure of governance quality? Joka, do you want to react to that one?
Sure. So on the EQI measure, it's primarily perception-based. We use the overall index, but it actually builds on 3 sub-pillars that look at quality, impartiality, and perceptions of and experience with corruption. So in the quality and impartiality sub-pillars, they're primarily asked about healthcare, education, and interactions with the police. And then the corruption questions would be a series of, have you ever paid a bribe or were you expected to? Do you think elections are fair? Do you think everyone is treated equally by tax authorities, for instance? So it captures quite a range, but it's more broadly perception-based than just trust. Maybe let me answer the last question that I just saw appear in the chat box on the ECI being surprisingly homogeneous. So in the map that I showed, that's actually artificial because everything over a score of 50 on a 0 to 100 scale was dark in that map because we wanted to focus attention on the EBRD regions. But actually, if you look at the bar chart that Julia was showing with the max and min scores within each country, even there you see that many of these advanced economies like Germany and France indeed do have less variation. So it's not just the artificial coloring in the map. Can I use this as a moment to respond to some of Julia's comments, maybe?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So first of all, thank you very much for the careful read and the very thoughtful comments. I'm sure I won't be able to address all of them, but maybe just a couple of quick reactions on the IV versus OLS coefficients. So in terms of the direction of the difference, this would, we think, be consistent with crises triggering improvements in governance. But indeed, the magnitudes are quite large. So while it passes the standard diagnostic tests, we are very aware that this is a time invariant instrument. We liked it because it has variation both within countries and across them. So for instance, we have regions within Poland that are part of 3 empires. We have within country variation, for instance, in Romania as well. But one of the extensions we would like to do is to interact with this with something that is more time varying in order to get more variation there and see how the magnitudes change. This also doesn't explicitly account for spatial dependence yet. On Hungary versus Spain, so we actually allow both to continue growing at some estimate of trend growth. So we look at convergence over time where both of them are growing. On the FDI ones, so the regions are fairly large, so zeros would not make much of a difference, but we have looked at various interpretations there. I think the capital city question you raised is actually very interesting because it seems to be driven by differences in the sectoral composition of projects. So let me very quickly take advantage of the fact that we're actually on Zoom now, so I can show you something I wasn't planning to show otherwise, if it works. But this is basically a snapshot over time. Just 1 second. Of FDI projects in the region. It's on from the same database. We've just added more projects to it in the meantime. And basically what you can see is that they first appear in capital cities, and a lot of this is in service sectors as well as construction. And then you can see a lot of these green dots appear, that's manufacturing. So manufacturing is both highly capital intensive, but it's also much more dispersed than other projects. So we think that some of the effect that we see on capital cities being not significant here is actually because governance matters less for the sort of service sector projects, business services and the like that tend to locate in cities and primarily in capital cities. And then finally, thank you very much for raising the point on appropriation versus facilitation, because I completely agree with your concern. And actually, as we launch the new transition report, which is called The State Strikes Back, one of the issues that keeps coming up is that we talk of it, that you could interpret it as a caring hand of the state versus the danger of a grabbing hand of the state. So let me end there, and thank you very much again for your comments.
Excellent. So there's one more question from Randolph, which relates to something you said. He wonders about sectoral composition within the public sector, how that impacts your analysis. And I think you started answering that with the slides you just showed. So yeah, the question is really, what about heterogeneity in the public sector, natural monopolies versus other types of activities?
Indeed. So there we've actually seen significant changes over time and quite a bit of heterogeneity across countries. So of course, you would be most concerned about uneven playing fields and disproportionate benefits to state-owned enterprises in sectors that are otherwise competitive. Now, these have fallen over time, especially in the richer economies of the EBRD regions. So state-owned enterprises would only account on average for about 10% of manufacturing employment, for instance, in Central Europe and the Baltics. It's not to say that there are important exceptions where we still see large state-owned enterprises in pharmaceuticals or chemicals, even in countries like Hungary or Poland. But state-owned enterprises are still much more common even in competitive sectors such as manufacturing in, for instance, Central Asia, but also Azerbaijan, Belarus. So there we would be much more concerned about governance. But over time, we do see a shift where they're more and more restricted to the sectors that are either networks or natural monopolies. So a lot in public utilities, transportation, such as trains and airlines. And we do see a bit of a blurring in the line between public and private sector. So in the context of the pandemic, we've seen large bailouts to state-owned airlines, but we've also seen large bailouts to private airlines. Some of the state-owned enterprises, in particular in energy, are also really large and much more like very large private companies within the sectors than really an extension of the public sector in that sense. So those lines are getting blurrier over time.
Thanks very much, Joka. So I've covered all the questions in the chat. Luca, I can probably hand back to you.
Can I have just a very quick question to the first paper? Can I just add it? Very quickly, do you by any chance check whether, it's just out of curiosity, there is some sort of link of between the white and the gray bribery?
What kind of link?
Well, I understand the white bribery is a bribery like emotionally driven, right? And the other one instead is a bribery values driven, right?
Yeah, it depends on the gray bribery is a scenario in which you have a sort of reciprocity, like you're building a relationship, and the first one is basically only being friendly to each other, trying to influence in that way. And
yeah, I just wonder whether the first one somehow has got probably technically it's not possible to do it, but I just wonder whether the first one can somehow, for quite few social psychological reasons, drive also to the second one.
Yeah, the point is not every participant saw all of the treatments, so we made some elaborate calculations on making sure that it doesn't bleed into the effects of the others. But actually, we could look more into this because there's always like pairs of vignettes that they saw. Like there's a subsample within the big data set that we have, where we could look at whether people who saw, for instance, the white bribery vignette first, would they react differently to the gray bribery vignette? We could look at this. We haven't because there's just not too much time.
That was just my curiosity, actually. It was not, but thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Welcome.
So, Gero, there are no other questions, right?
Nope.
I guess we can get closer to the closing, probably. It's also because, wow, we managed to get exactly on time. So yes, so so thank you so much for the participation to all the speakers and to all the participants for the very engaging sessions and seminars, and also since this is the last one, also for the previous seminars. And I also thank UCL for the access to the Zoom, and and of course Winner for the sponsorship. But personally, because it's the last session, I would like to thank Gerard, Elodie, and Randolph, because we've been working and preparing events for the last 3 years, and I have to say that it's always a pleasure and it's always fun. So besides being interesting events, but it's very nice working with you. So thank you. And for the last things, I would like to pass the closing words to Gerard, because Gerard is essentially he has been our frontline organizer since the beginning. So it's very fair to give the last words to Gerard. So Gerard, you're concluding.
Thank you, and you make me be the person who means that we're closing late. So yeah, no, I just wanted to thank everybody for participating, for submissions, for presenting. It's so it was meant to be at Loughborough University London, and I was really looking forward to having a physical event here, and then COVID happened. But we're actually really pleased with how well this worked from our perspective. I mean, we've attracted papers from literally all over the world, including Mexico to Japan to Korea to Switzerland to everywhere, which was great, which we couldn't have done probably in person. So we're sort of keen on continuing with something, you know, along these lines in addition to our yearly physical event, and we'll be in touch with more details shortly. We will encourage you to sign up for some sort of newsletter or mailing list, not newsletter necessarily, but mailing list where we can keep in touch, because we feel there's some sort of community here, you know, around similar questions of corruption, informal institutions, informality, and so forth. And we would sort of like to make this a sort of a community that stays in touch regularly. So I'll probably send an email or a message via Eventbrite to everybody who has signed up for any of the 4. Sorry if you signed up for more than one, then you'll receive more than one email from me, but some people only signed up for one. So hopefully, yeah, Estonia, sorry. Okay, Gizis, I forgot to mention Estonia is obviously also one of the countries. But yeah, so thanks very much, everybody. I think I'll leave it here. We're 2 minutes late. But other than that, I felt this was an excellent workshop with excellent presentations and discussions. Thank you so much, everybody, and hopefully see you at one of our future events. Hopefully Loughborough University London will be able to host it in person. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.